Prevention Network. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm joining you from today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on today's webinar. For the next 75 minutes, we're going to take a peek into the future of injury prevention in Australia with some leading experts across the fields of policy, research, and as well as NGOs. We hope to gain an understanding of how we can work together within our injury prevention sector and I guess work together to find and improve outcomes in injury prevention and have a look at what's needed for the workforce in the future. Our expert panel today is made up of Professor Stuart Newstead, who is the director of the Monash University Accident Research Centre, Denise Sullivan, who is Director of Chronic Disease Prevention with WA Health, Dr. Kate Hunter, who is a member of the AIPN Executive Committee and Senior Research Fellow at the George Institute, and Justin Scarr, Chief Executive Officer of Royal Lifesaving Australia. During the webinar, we will be using the Q&A function to take questions from the audience for the panel. So as you're thinking of them, please pop them down in the Q&A function and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Just quickly, we will be recording the webinar and hopefully we'll be able to make that available to people after the session in case anyone couldn't make it. I remind our panel members to please take yourself off mute while you're speaking. And with that, we shall get underway. I will hand you over to our moderator for the panel conversation today, Professor Richard Franklin from James Cook University. Richard is also co-convener of the PHIA Injury Prevention Special Interest Group and President of KidSafe Australia. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Rachel, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's really exciting to be here and chatting about it because we are certainly at the crossroads of injury prevention in Australia with a potential new plan coming out. Obviously, a great burden that we're seeing coming through, and off the back of a world conference in Adelaide last year gives us some momentum to move forward. I also want to recognise the traditional owners. I'm on the Bindal and Wugaraba people's lands here in Townsville and say Wadamuli to you all, which is hello or welcome in the local Bindal language. Now, most of our panel members have multiple hats and do lots of things, so we'll quickly whip around the group and see what they're up to, what their backgrounds are, and what some of their passion expertise is. So firstly, I'll go to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. And just to let everyone know that I'm coming from the lands of the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation. So I'm based in Sydney. As Rachel has said, I'm a Senior Research Fellow at and working with Gunamana, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Program at the George Institute. So I'm one of only 3 non-Aboriginal people working in Gunamana amongst a team of 18. I've worked in injury prevention and as an injury researcher for many, many years now. And I have a particular, I guess, if you want to focus on an injury area, my key areas of interest have been generally road safety as well as burn injury. But that said, I've got a particular interest or passion in community-led programs and evaluation of those and community-driven and relevant work and the conduct of really pragmatic trials. And from that, I have a keen interest in seeing translation of research into policy and practice. So I sit on and have sat on the Council for KidSafe New South Wales for a number of years. Currently the co-chair, have been the chair of KidSafe New South Wales, and I'm also, as Rachel alluded to, an executive member of the Australasian Injury Prevention Network. And I guess one of the key things that is of relevance today that I'm working on, I work across a number of different areas, but of course, one of the key ones is the upcoming and we do believe it is upcoming, National Strategy for Injury Prevention. So that'll be me for the time being.
Thank you very much, Kate. Excited to hear that the upcoming plan
Aren't we
is
all? Yes.
upcoming. So, Stuart, I'll hand over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I am coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Victoria. I'm the Director and Professor of the Monash University Accident Research Centre. The Accident Research Centre was established about 36 years ago now as a non-faculty based centre at Monash University to bring together transdisciplinary research teams to work on all aspects of injury prevention and safety science. MEARC has a strong reputation for road safety, but works across the whole injury prevention spectrum, from injury surveillance through road safety, through workplace safety, and we have a very strong presence in disaster preparedness and resilience as well. Like Kate, we're very keen on the idea of working very closely with our stakeholders to formulate relevant injury prevention research to serve the needs of the practitioner and policy community, and to make sure that that research is understood and translated into practice as well as possible. Myself, I am a statistician by training, so I get very excited about anything to do with data. And so my expertise is in developing data systems, evaluation, safety strategy modelling. We also have a very strong program in my research team in the area of vehicle safety as well. So we produce the used car safety ratings, which is publicised in most jurisdictions across Australia through the state transport authorities, and also done a lot of work in the space of vehicle safety regulation with the Commonwealth Government recently to help get things like electronic stability control and autonomous braking into our vehicle fleet as mandatory fitment to improve injury prevention. As I say, I get excited about anything to do with data, and I think you'll probably hear of that a bit through the rest of the webinar this morning. So nice to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Stuart. Great to have you on board. Always great to have another data nerd in the room to talk all things data, but also the translation, such an important aspect of what we do in the injury space. So over to you, Denise.
Hi, so thank you very much for the invitation to participate in today's forum. I'm Denise Sullivan. I'm currently Director Chronic Disease Prevention with the WA Department of Health, and I'm participating from Perth, so land of the Whadjuk people. I've had a long history working in public health, probably in excess of 25 years, and I've worked both in the not-for-profit sector as well as the government sector. So experience of two domains and opportunity to gain some fairly deep insights into what's possible within the not-for-profit versus the government sector. Much of my early career was working in tobacco control and had the opportunity to work not only on a national but an international stage. So had the opportunity to represent WA and Australian NGO interest in tobacco control as part of negotiations around the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So it was quite fascinating just to see what's involved in getting up public health legislation in an international forum, which is essentially what the FCTC is. The last 12 to 15 years, I've been working specifically in chronic disease prevention. So in my role, I have responsibility for setting strategic direction and vision for the state as it relates to chronic disease prevention, with a particular focus on risk factors that are common to most preventable non-communicable diseases. And that also includes injury prevention, given there is certainly some overlapping interests. And particular interest in child safety, water safety, road safety, and falls prevention within the community. In my years of working in public health, I've certainly got a strong interest in health communications, public health research, workforce planning and development, particularly given, you know, a strong cohort of public health advocates, and one in which we also focus on intergenerational change is very important to achieving what are fairly long and hefty goals that we are trying to achieve in public health. And that's probably it for me. So thank you.
No, thanks, Denise. Thank you for being here, and really appreciate an insight both into obviously the NGO, but also the government sector and how you think and work and the challenges that you're facing as well, which we'll come into in a little bit more detail as we work through. And great to hear that you've got a whole range of issues, including workforce, which we will come back and talk a little bit more about later on. So Justin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm Justin Scarr. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Life Saving Society and also Chair of the Australian Water Safety Council. I'm coming from Cammeraygal land, the custodians of the land, water and air in my local area. I do have business up the top, pajamas down below. I've got the flu at the moment, so I'm protecting you all and also my colleagues from the office here in Sydney. I feel a bit one-dimensional in this wonderful panel, like some fascinating backgrounds, and I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit from Denise and Stuart and Kate. And I could see on Kate's face the joy of contemplating a national injury prevention plan being released very, very shortly. I guess if you think about my background, I'm somewhat of a bridge, actually. I in water safety particularly, I tend to have a foot in lots of camps working with policymakers, traditional water safety people that really love the water and love keeping people safe and in and around the water. I'm also doing a PhD in my spare time with the George Institute, Associate Professor Jagnal Jagnal. I'm looking more specifically at strategy, policy in the global context of drowning prevention. So I've been involved in wonderful things like bringing people together to create the Australian Water Safety Strategy in the last number of iterations. I tend to find myself sort of using research and data in an advocacy sense, trying to convince policymakers and people to change the way they're doing things. And then internationally, I've done quite a bit of work with the World Health Organization around the UN resolution for global drowning prevention, but really excited to join you all in this discussion about injury prevention, but feeling a little bit one-dimensional.
Thank you, Justin. You shouldn't feel one-dimensional, because I think you nailed it when you said, you know, it's complex when you look at the water space, and it's same with road safety or burns or falls. At a broad brush, we think it's a very simple kind of area, but when we start to work in those spaces, we realise how complex it is. And particularly, I think those relationships that kind of come into those spaces and the way that we work, which leads me to talking to you, Denise, with the first question that we've got for today is, what does good government policy look like, obviously from a WA perspective, when we're looking at injury prevention, and what can we learn from one another in that kind of government space, and how can you let us know as practitioners and also as people that work in the NGO sector about your needs from a government perspective to help you do better policy to achieve what you want to achieve from a government perspective?
I might just start by giving a bit of an overview in terms of how the Health Department works in the injury prevention space and how we manage our relationships with other sectors. So certainly the department works with a whole range of stakeholders. So there are, we work with the community services, not-for-profit community, and certainly there are a number of NGOs within this state that have contracts to deliver a number of statewide population level programs as they relate to falls prevention, water safety and child safety. We also working quite closely with other state government agencies, because the reality is as the Department of Health, we're not able to be all things in the injury prevention space. It's a fairly diverse field with a lot of big, complex individual injury issues, each with their own tribe, for want of a better word. So for us, it's very much picking what can we lead on where there's a gap and what currently sits with other government agencies. So we have an interest and role in road safety, for instance, particularly in terms of research, data, information around health and treatment, etc. But there is another state government agency that leads on that, another state government agency that leads on product safety, and another state government agency that leads on family and domestic violence, for instance. So we do spend a lot of time working quite closely with other state government agencies in terms of who's the policy lead on what, as well as the work that we do with the not-for-profit sector. We also work hard to maintain current awareness of injury issues. So while we choose to specialise in a few things, we do need to maintain some sort of working knowledge of what's happening more broadly in injury prevention. And certainly the relationships with the research university sector is really critical for that. We don't necessarily have full knowledge of and deep knowledge of all injuries or issues in injury prevention. So there's need for certainly a critical need for a good community of practice that we can reach out to for information to support us in our work. The other is we also play a role in trying to ensure that there's good collaboration within the sector. So one of the things that we do in WA is we actually fund Injury Matters to deliver a program which is, oh my God, I can't believe I just had a mental blank in the name. Help me out,
Shall I jump
Rachel.
in? No injury.
No injury.
Yeah.
I know it as the boring contract
Yeah.
name, Partnership and Sector Development. So one of the things that certainly struck me when I started new into my role as Director of Chronic Disease Prevention, and we inherited a number of contracts in the injury prevention space, was the extent to which there wasn't a lot of good collaboration and work more broadly within the injury prevention sector. So you had different tribes doing their own thing, not a lot of information sharing, and probably quite variable in terms of the degree of sophistication and expertise depending on which tribe you were dealing with. So certainly the funding that we've provided to Injury Matters to deliver this hub has been a useful way of helping to build up knowledge and expertise within the field more broadly, but also encourage that sort of bigger, stronger coalition that you need. Because if you're wanting to help drive and set a policy agenda, then you need to be able to demonstrate that there's a strong coalition behind it. There's many voices. And the voices are speaking in unison. So they're not sort of at odds with one another. I think the other thing is also taking the time to sort of develop, if you don't work in the government sector, taking the time to sort of develop a good knowledge about how government works and where and how you might best have influence. You know, certainly the way in which I work, my door is open. So if there are NGOs that are wanting to come and speak with me about a particular issue of concern to them, and wanting to have an understanding about how do we influence a government agenda, or why aren't we gaining traction? What are we missing, not doing here? Then I think sort of conversations with those that work in government is pretty, a helpful guide in terms of how messages are being framed, how the ask is being put, what else is going on in that policy space that might be a barrier to gaining the traction that you're needing or wanting to do. That's probably it from me. I feel like I've sort of rattled on a bit there.
No, thanks very much for that. I think it's very helpful for us, and I think your point about getting to know how government works is really critical to the way that we work. Can I just delve into that slightly? Do you go and seek information? Are you wanting people to knock on your door? How do you get to know more about those injury areas that you're working on?
In a number of ways. So there's a very small team for injury prevention that sit within my directorate. I don't know that that's common across government. I think WA was probably one of the few to actually have an injury prevention policy area within the department, although that is starting to slowly change across some of the other jurisdictions. So very much a reliance on the work that we do at an individual level in terms of maintaining our professional knowledge of the area in which we work. The other is also the time we put into expanding our professional networks. So it's developing up relationships across government, but also developing relationships with other NGOs and researchers that work in the field. So we have a good understanding of, who's working on what, who knows what, who's got deep knowledge of, who's got really great international networks. So we're needing to you look more broadly in terms of what might be happening in other countries, for instance, who can assist us with that. So it's very much around relationship building. And I have to say that's probably been one of the biggest priorities in my role as director within the Department of Health, is about the strength of the collaboration and cooperation that I'm able to gain through work with others.
Thanks, Denise. And I think that's a nice segue to you, Justin, in talking about, I guess, the NGO role. You talked before about the advocacy work that you do and the need to kind of, I guess, talk to people like Denise and bring them on board and have those conversations. So how do you work from an NGO perspective? How do you get your voice into government? What can we learn, I guess, from the water safety experience that you've been working on?
Thanks, Richard. Actually, Denise was it's quite fascinating, and I think really quite valuable for injury prevention people to get a window into how government officers work and how they navigate the issue. So a couple of things that really resonated for me, and maybe I'll give some examples in a water safety sense. I think people need to understand that government. Well, in our country, there's 8 of them, but actually each government, you kind of divide them multiple times in a sense. So fundamentally, injury prevention tends to intersect with the Departments of Health, which speak a very specific language that most people on this webinar would be very, very familiar with. But sometimes our water safety issues intersect with other government agencies and departments that have a completely different set of cues and codes and languages and acronyms, etc. So that tends to be our first challenge. The other thing we should remember, though, that government is divided in two, in a sense. We've got politicians, which actually work in a different way to perhaps the technocrats, the specialists that are able to really understand the nuts and bolts of policy and reach out to advocates and NGOs and other groups, academics and the like. I think we need to remember, or what I always remember, is that it works best if you're highly principled and focused on the issue first and foremost. Many people in Denise's role will get lobbied in a terrible use of the word. They won't get provided with information and advice, but they'll get lobbied and counter lobbied by NGOs working against each other. It may not happen as much in Western Australia, but it certainly happens across the East Coast and in Canberra, where what you might be trying to achieve is equally driven and passionate by another group, but actually the two groups are working in competition, and so the information that they're providing to a department is contrasting or contradicting. But even in that act of going into a government agency and talking to them about your issue, at the same time undermining another group, we should recognise it actually undermines the whole process. In many cases, it's a guarantee that nothing will get done. I find that in a water safety sense, governments sort of tend to not like, but like this idea that everyone's sort of talking different things and wanting different priorities, undermining each other. It's a real excuse in many respects not to act. And we've had that in water safety pre-COVID. So in 2019, early 20, we were developing a new water safety strategy. It was released in the first sort of 12 months of COVID. And then since then, we've had this real fragmentation of advocacy on water safety issues. We've had a number of state elections, which again sort of confuse things. We've had increased drowning, likely attributable to changes in patterns of exposure in water safety, which again has sort of created this washing machine of ideas on what the problem is and what the solution is. And I think the lesson for us actually is we've got to get more aligned. We're much better off going to government together with some consistent sense of what the problem is and what solutions have been tested and might work, rather than this sort of washing machine of ideas and counter advocacy. Water safety has been pretty successful. We work very closely with Surf Lifesaving nationally, and generally when we're speaking to government, we are speaking with one voice, but we've certainly seen over the last couple of years sort of this really fragmentation of what the priority and what the solution might be.
Yeah, thanks very much, Justin. And I think that goes to what Denise was talking to before about building coalitions. And I'm glad you brought up the Water Safety Council and bringing together the different groups there to try and have a consistent voice to government. I think this kind of then goes well to you, Kate, to start talking about kind of workforce issues. Seeing as you're here talking a little bit about the plan, But I guess how do we kind of also leverage and bring new people in? Denise was talking about this before as well, about workforce development, about, I guess, partly about succession planning to bring new people in, but developing that kind of whole space around injury that I think is really needed. Kate?
I couldn't agree more there. It certainly is needed. And I think you also alluded to it at the beginning as well, Richard, that we are poised to reorient our thinking around injury prevention and really reimagining this space. And that also works its way into the workforce. One of the key things that we're recognising, and Justin, you spoke about it, around differences in approach, in perspective of priorities. But what there is an opportunity to identify our shared goals and really feed and leverage off those shared goals. And I think we can do that by creating those networks that Denise spoke about, and those collaborations that are more than just being part of a network, but that really work towards their shared agenda. And I think that enables us to be poised to move forward and almost take a systems approach to injury prevention, recognising that we need, when I talk about the need for diversity within the workforce, I'm of course talking about identity and understanding the breadth of knowledge that's out there, but I'm also talking about specialties and the need for health economics to be fed into injury and injury prevention. We need to expand our thinking around wellness and well-being and a well-being budget, because all of those things feed into injury. So recognising that people involved in urban planning are critical injury prevention members of the workforce. So I think there's the opportunity to ensure that that connection between injury prevention, safety promotion, health and well-being are all shared, and that opportunity to share that knowledge amongst policymakers, practitioners, NGOs, community members, really calls for the need to have effective communicators within injury as well. So I think there's such a broad opportunity to really expand our way of thinking and thinking about injury and injury prevention and our approach to it. And of course, we can talk lots about data and data sharing. Perhaps we might pause and come back to that at some later stage, but there's a lot of opportunities there to have people who are across data in its breadth. So I'm talking beyond the within quantitative data, understanding the analyses and the interpretation of those data and how those data are collected and how a picture of those data, to looking at ways of ensuring the data are used to promote health and safety and well-being. And I think part of the opportunity is to really expand that workforce in generating the interest amongst community that injury prevention is a right. It's a right to be safe and to live and grow to our fullest. And I think with that, we can really expand our thinking as to who constitutes the injury prevention workforce.
Thanks very much, Kate. And I think you're starting to allude to some of the future of this diverse workforce, bringing in a range of people, but disciplines. And I think this is one of the real challenges for us in injury, is to be mature enough to accept that there are others out there that would have different ways of looking at what we're doing, but also that we're mature enough as a field that people will seek us out to partner with us when we've kind of got that content knowledge that Denise was talking about before. So I think it is complex, and I'm glad you brought up kind of the systems approach, because we certainly need to be thinking more about the way that things work and the way that we do things. And certainly data is just one of those aspects as we kind of look into it. And I think, Stuart, this is a really good point to bring you in with the kind of a little bit of talk about data, but also around the research and training work that you guys are doing. And we've talked a lot about connecting people. So what does a future of connected researchers, policymakers and practitioners look like? And how have MUARC been doing this over the last, 36 years or something?
36 years, that's right. I think one of the things that can facilitate this, and this is where we've been developing at MUARC, is you have to offer a diverse range of educational offerings. Communication is essentially education, and you have to identify all the different players in a system and a workforce and how they need to be educated differently. So the sort of structure that we've been looking at in recent times is to offer a range of what we call professional education. Universities often get hung up on, oh, everyone needs to do a PhD, but everyone doesn't need to do a PhD. People need to actually get the education that's suitable for the role that they play in the system as we see it. And so we offer everything from, we'll start with a practitioner course. So for a practitioner, it's really about trying to get those people that are working at the coalface to understand how to interpret information and use it to the best effect. That's a really important part of education, is to get people, and that brings the different people together then to say, okay, I have to make this happen. How do I get that knowledge and how do I interpret it to the best effect? And that sort of goes back to what Justin was saying about all playing from the same hymn sheet, if you like, is if people have that basic education to use that, it's a good start. The next level is probably in leadership. How do you lead as a safety professional? And that's about how you take opportunities, how you build collaborations, how you take that information, and to a certain degree, how you invest in generating the information that will bring the task forward. And so leadership is a really important component in the educational spectrum as well, in terms of and bringing the field along. Next is probably the high level thinking. At MUARC, we offer a graduate certificate now in road safety, but that could equally be developed into the injury prevention area. And it's about critical thinking. It's about not being sort of told the recipe. It's about, you've got to now develop the recipe and how you do things. And very much at that graduate certificate level, it's about bringing people in who can combine their leadership skills and their technical knowledge to become leaders in the field. And you need leaders in every aspect of the field in injury prevention, whether it be within government, whether it be in NGOs, whether it be in the people sort of on the ground putting out the policies. You need that leadership at all stages. And then above that, you have the progression into your master's and PhD type programs where you become a real specialist in an area and you can demonstrate. But we need that education covered at every level and the offerings to be appropriate. And so what we need to be doing is talking with the key people in the field and saying, what sort of education offerings do you need, and developing those within the institutions that have the best capacity and knowledge to do that well and can deliver it at the coalface. So I think that they're really important aspects of education that will help the communication. Also, within our research that we do, building in translation and communication aspects so people can use and understand that research are really important. Don't stop with the paper in the journal. That's not good enough. You need to be running webinars. You need to be running workshops and helping people understand what you've done and take that next step, because I think that's where academia has failed a little bit. It's caught up in its own process. And it forgets there's actually real people out there in the world that need to be using this stuff and understanding it, not with a traditional academic vocabulary, but with a practitioner vocabulary on what's been done as well. And that's about what does this mean, but also what are the limitations of what we've done here? What can't you interpret from this as well? And understanding both those aspects of what is produced in the academic field are really important for making sure that we get the best practice out there, because that's been a real gap. And it takes real talent and real training and experience to be able to do that well. But it also takes the partnerships that we've talked about to be able to understand each other's domains. So I need to understand how Denise works in government. I need to understand how Justin works in his NGO, to understand how they need to use information to be able to talk about what we've done. And they need to be, to some degree, understand how the research process works to create that interface between the two as well. So that's sort of my view on where academia and education needs to go in the field to push some of this forward.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart, and really interesting to kind of hear about that, I guess, having the right product for what you're wanting to achieve as part of it. I'd also obviously give a big call out to the AIPN and the PHAA as tools or avenues for translating your research as well. If you're sitting in that space and kind of working through that, there's a number of policies that they develop up and use to influence the sector and work with others as part of it. I am just going to pick up on, everybody's talked about the need to work together. Denise, and I'm going to go back to you a little bit, talking about how do you, from a health perspective, you talked about bringing in other departments. How does this look in reality? How do we actually bring people together, and how will we be able to do this better so in the future we're all working well together from a health perspective in government?
I don't think there's any single right way of doing it. It can take different forms from, I think, informal relationships that you develop over time. We tend to get caught up in the busyness of our working days and create quite transactional relationships, which might get something done, but it doesn't necessarily lead to maybe that longer, deeper working relationship that might help us to achieve some of those bigger public health injury prevention goals further down the track. So I think it's as much around developing up those informal relationships as well as creating forums that bring people together. So, certainly how I work across government, for instance, it happens in a number of ways. There may be senior officer groups that are created around bigger P policy agendas, which may outwardly have absolutely nothing to do with injury, but there's a potential to insert injury as part of the dialogue conversations that occur within that group. So for me, a couple of examples will be, I'm on an urban mobility cross-government reference group, and issues have come up around micromobility, e-ridables, and some of the health and social and other issues that have arisen with that. So there's an opportunity to have a conversation around an injury policy priority, but it's in another setting. Equally, there's also the work that we do through Injury Matters, through the hub that they've created, which gives an opportunity to bring the broader injury prevention sector together, both government and non-government, to focus on key issues. There's also informal relationships I may have across government with my peer group. I have to say there's not much in the way of formal groups that exist that are interjurisdictional when it relates to the prevention agenda more broadly, let alone injury. But the reality is there's stuff that's happening behind the scenes, which is more informal. So there's an opportunity to have a more elevated conversation, I suppose, with Tier 3 2 officers across other health agencies around the injury prevention agenda. I think the other thing too is that when you're trying to develop up relationships between government, NGO, etc., I think there's also a need for an understanding of each other's strengths and limitations. So needing to go into those relationships with a clear understanding about, well, what's within their scope of responsibilities, their power, versus what's in mine. So you're not sort of having unrealistic expectations of one another, where eventually you're going to hit a brick wall because you're pushing for something that particular agency or individual is not able to do for you. The other is, I think, also pragmatism in terms of what's possible. And the other is ability to seize opportunities when they arise. One of the things I didn't mention when you were talking about, working with government is the government policy agenda, on the one hand, can seem very slow moving like a sea tanker, but things can suddenly change depending on a change in government, a change in minister, some event that occurs that triggers and elevates the priority for a particular issue. So sometimes there needs to be a readiness to put aside what might be a big ask that you want now because something else has become possible. So there's, I think, also a bit of pragmatism and an ability to respond to a shifting policy agenda as part of those collaborations that you're trying to develop over time.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I mean, I think considering what we've just been through, the need to kind of have some future direction and some, area that you want to see yourself in is obviously super important, and things can change on a dime, so to speak. And I think that, if we take this kind of getting together, so what are those steps? If we were to step through and say, what can we do as a community to help step through and create those? And I jotted down some things like go to a conference and catch up with people and talk to one another and try and move from transactional to more of a working relationship as part of it. But how do I, particularly if I'm new and don't know where I'm going, how do I step through to get to where we are having those meaningful relationships?
Well, I think, as you said, it's participating in events that bring you in contact with the people that you're wanting to connect with. The other is also seeking meetings. I think you probably find that people are more willing to meet and talk than you think, but it's also how you handle that meeting. Justin talked about the washing machine. I've certainly had experience of being inundated with various NGOs wanting to come and talk to me, but the conversation is around what money can you give me to fund my particular issue or ensure the sustainability of my organisation. So it just becomes a single meeting about an ask that most often I'm not able to satisfy. I think it's also meeting with people and taking the time to get to know them and understand the social milieu that's government. That doesn't always fit with people's critical needs for funding for research or funding for sustainability of organisations. But unless you put time into relationships, I don't think you're necessarily going to get the traction that you want with government policymakers, for instance, over time. And the reality is those relationships with policymakers are really important because they endure beyond the life cycle of members of parliament and ministers. So they are important relationships to put time into. They can also, provide some early insights where there might be a need perhaps to shift direction in terms of some of the asks that you're putting to government.
Excellent. So I just want to remind people that we do have the Q&A going. If people do want to ask any questions, can they drop them into the Q&A there as part of that process? Denise, really thank you for all those insights as part of it. Kate, I'm just going to go to you now. You've obviously been trying to negotiate this space, with the development of the plan, but also, putting on your AIPN hat as part of it. What do you see as the next steps that we need to try and achieve for this future that everybody is healthy and safe in Australia from an injury prevention perspective?
Yes, the next steps are multiple, and I think what I'd probably do is talk a little bit, going back to what some of the things Denise was talking about, recognizing that need for agility and that need that we do have to be able to respond quickly, but also needing to balance that with long-term vision. And I think it's that shared long-term vision that sometimes is where that washing machine occurs, because people's needs for here and now in their sustainability starts overriding that long-term vision. And I think as long as we keep that long-term vision in good vision, then I think that is a fantastic start. I think one of the key things, and this is a shout out to the upcoming Australasian Injury Prevention Conference in March next year, that really is talking about what are the things that can we learn from an injury prevention perspective, can we learn from First Nations people. And so I think, we have seen within the results from COVID, particularly in that first couple of years, the importance of connection. You've spoken, Denise, about the importance of relationality and building those relationships, and that's one of the key things that has driven some of that success from a First Nations perspective, is really ensuring reciprocity in that relationship forming. And I think that's one of the things that we can learn in all our injury prevention initiatives, is that Another is from a government perspective, as Denise also alluded to, was having injury/safety in all policy. And that really does cut to the understanding that injury has a lot of really critical risk factors and precursors. So if we address various inequities, then we can certainly go towards reducing the burden of injury and injury experience. So I think from that government perspective, that opportunity for having that long-term vision, recognising the parameters that we're all aware of, but also being able to learn from where there's been effective approaches elsewhere, and having some of that learning that Stuart focused on earlier around disaster preparedness and what's worked there in harnessing communities and the strengths of communities in injury prevention is something that we haven't really tapped into in a comprehensive way, and I think there's lots of opportunity there. I can talk a little bit more about that need for establishing that shared coordination and leveraging from what the various NGOs experience, and we all know and have experienced amongst NGOs that the very real balance of having to keep staff on board, and that talks to that need for sustainable funding. And so I think that there are opportunities for us to really build in sustainability better into our injury prevention initiatives and supporting organisations to do that. And we can talk about that a little later, and it is around that, instilling those networks working towards whatever that particular NGO is interested in, using car seats as an example, ensuring that programs that are very much at that community level are drawing on existing similar programs so that they're leveraging off each other and building that collective strength. And I think there's a lot of untapped opportunities there in our injury prevention landscape.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there are lots of untapped opportunities. And I think, again, you talk about this kind of strategic and vision, and certainly the strategic opportunism that Denise was talking about before. We saw that. I mean, I use this in my teaching with the Port Arthur stuff. We've done a lot of work around policy and gun policy and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And that happened. And it was only because we were in a position and knew what we wanted that we could kind of leverage off that. And I think this goes to what you're talking as well, Stuart. You're talking about leadership, and thinking about how we bring people into that space. Can you just elaborate on that and what that looks like and what the next steps are for us in building that kind of leadership space for injury prevention?
Well, I think leadership comes at all levels. I very much agree with Kate that you need a common vision that people are working to, because that gives people the focus, and that's worked well in areas like road safety, where you have this Vision Zero or whatever its other incarnations are. But I think a vision without a view to the mechanisms of how you make that vision work is absolutely pointless. And I think there's so many problems we have in the injury prevention space at the moment which don't make the machine work towards the vision that we actually need to fix. Obviously, as a statistician, the first thing I would point to is data, and Justin talked before about his washing machine. The reason we often have a washing machine is because we don't have data available, so people can come up with their own facts, Donald Trump style maybe, and that's not helpful. But if you have good national available data collections that people can draw on to do good research with and good policy work with, that helps enormously focus us together in the one direction. So leadership in that area is important. We seem to spend more time with the lawyers arguing over getting access and what we can do with data at the moment than we actually spend time actually using the data for things. We have to overcome that problem. So identifying and setting up key national data systems to support injury prevention research is critical. I mean, you look at the embarrassment. We don't have a national serious injury data set for road safety in this country. We're working on it, but we've been working on it for years and we never quite seem to get there. we need to understand what our key metrics are we're going to work for in injury prevention so we can actually define what we're trying to achieve in that way. And that's really critical to get those basics right. That's going to require leadership and investment in that area. It always makes me very sad that people, when they're looking for government savings, often data collection is the first thing they cut out because that's expensive, yet they never think about the benefits it brings in all other aspects that you do in terms of accuracy and consistency. I think Justin mentioned before the idea of needing an overlay of health economics on everything. This is going to be really important injury prevention for putting it into the right context. You just need to sort of draw the comparisons with road safety and how well it's set up its health economics type model for justifying what it does and the benefit to society versus other areas. In Victoria, you just have to look at the TAC's approach versus WorkSafe's approach. WorkSafe's currently going broke. TAC is doing very well and pays dividends because it invests in prevention and you can quantify the economics of investing in prevention. So you need leadership in that space because nothing talks better to governments and their willingness to invest than having a good economic basis for what you're doing. If you can start that conversation, you can do it consistently. But it also talks about the need for things like we need a common costing measure for injury prevention that can be used across all disciplines and put it. I mean, I know Kate goes, "Oh my God, that's a big big ask," but it's something we probably need to think about because if we're all playing from the same hymn book on terms of what injury costs society, and I know we have the global burden of disease type studies which try to give us those sort of metrics, but they're not done very well. We need one for a local context. We're all singing from the same hymn sheet, applied to good nationally available data sets that people can get hold of. We point to the US and we have things like the Fatal Accident Reporting System and the National Accident Sampling System. They're publicly available data sources which have been leveraged so often to provide excellent outcomes. Everyone sings from the same hymn book. They can be used and they've generated so much value. Yet I doubt that anyone's ever probably sat back and said, what is the benefit cost of that as a data set? And what could we do if we had a similar system in Australia? And don't worry about just road safety. This needs to come across all injury prevention domains in the same way. So we have to think about those enabling bodies. It's interesting to hear Denise talk about collaborations and the role of government, but collaboration is something that actually costs money. If we don't invest in it, we don't get good collaborations. And it's often something that's overlooked, particularly when you're working in the university sector. You're expected to go and make friends with government and friends with everyone else, but no one's paying for that. So it comes at an enormous personal cost to be able to actually do that, but it is really important. So thinking about how we can make collaborations and also invest in sustainability of capacity, because it's another excellent thing that Kate refers to. If we don't invest in the sustainability of our capacity, we continually lose it. We often see that in government as well. We lose knowledge and that capacity disappears and the whole focus on what we do disappears as well. So capacity in the NGOs, capacity in research, capacity in government to actually work on this as a specialist industry. These are the mechanisms I think are really going to help take injury prevention forward to the next step if we can get them in place. But they're too ad hoc at the moment and they're not working consistently to actually be able to coordinate people's efforts into the outcome. Even the way that things like government contracts are run, they're often just setting people against people, and the inefficiency that comes with that in people wasting time preparing bids that are very good, but only 1 out of 5 submitted gets up. There's a whole lot of time wasted behind that too. So understanding how to get all those right, and I don't necessarily have the answers to this, but I think they're things that need to be focused on as mechanisms to make sure we can make the next step in injury prevention in a way that is not pitching person against person and getting everyone singing from that same hymn sheet.
Thanks, Stuart. So obviously some advice there about investing in data and good information systems as part of it. Justin, I'm going to move across to you as one of the areas which I think is working well in Australia. We've got road safety, which is doing a good job. We've got a good job around drowning. But what are the next steps for really ramping it up, I guess, to the next stage around having a country that's free of drowning or minimises the risk of people drowning? And I'm going to ask you a little bit about risk factors as well, because we've heard risk factors pop up a little bit, but do we know enough about them as we kind of think about our next steps?
Thanks. I was gearing up to talk about collaboration and talk about the critical skill sets that we need in as individuals and as organisations, Richard. But thank you for the question. Look, I think the recurring theme here is that we at least in water safety have a blueprint for the next 10 years. It's the Australian Water Safety Strategy 2030. And when these sort of pragmatic opportunities that Denise was referring to, I'd like to think that policymakers, even politicians, reach into the cupboard of the Australian Water Safety Strategy and go, well, actually, if you have a problem that relates to migrants, well, actually a good group of people got together and figured that out, what the logic model might be for success in that particular area over the next 4 or 5 years. So I think in many respects, we kind of have a blueprint there. We have a good sense of what needs to happen in each of the areas of water safety progress. But what we've got to get better at doing is actually just managing momentum. And so these plans are absolutely worthless if they sit here in my office, right? It's kind of pointless unless we're actually connecting that nexus between the plan and what's actually happening out in communities. So you'll see in the Australian Water Safety Strategy sense, what we're figuring out is we're bypassing state governments, because state governments, for the most part, although Western Australia has some really good investments in injury prevention in the water safety domain, but we have this sort of total gap of action at a state government level for water safety plans and the like. So we've actually had to bypass the state governments and focus on localising water safety and water safety plans. We did some research where we figured out that in terms of rivers, lakes and dams, and Amy Pete and most of you would know was involved in this research, that we actually looked at who would impact on prevention at a local community level. And we realised that the water, Richard, and you were part of this research as well, the water was owned by 5 or 6 different groups. There were water authorities, there were local government, there were tourism operators, there were national parks and wildlife that all had some influence over prevention at a local level. So our focus in terms of generating momentum for our plans down at a community level is somewhat similar to our national plan, which is to actually convene groups, bring people together from multi-sectors to try and focus on what the local problem is and what those localised solutions might mean. Again, that can't just be another document. It's got to actually mobilise and move people to action. If we think about water safety, what are the big things we've got to figure out in the next 10 years? I think one of the things that's occupying a lot of our concern is just this gradual falling of swimming and water safety ability across the whole Australian population. Water safety for too long has been the domain of Speedo-wearing Aussies that have consumed the great Australian way of life of teaching their kids to swim. Generally, water safety is talked about by people like me. And what we've got to do is sort of reverse that sort of paradigm and make sure that all Australians understand that swimming or swimming ability is a right, that it doesn't only come with preventative opportunities, but it comes with the great joy of being able to swim and boat and sail and recreate. So we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how we convince not only governments, but parents and other businesses, how they can get involved in trying to make sure that all Australian children are able to swim. And when we say able to swim, we're talking about swimming and water safety, float for 2 minutes, swim a range of strokes, keep themselves out of trouble in and around the water. You'll see in a water safety sense a lot of energy put into that particular issue over the next 5 years. Because if we don't figure that out, what we'll see is this sort of, endless summer of drowning deaths right across the population, because swimming ability is one of those things that, keeps people out of trouble generally. We're also really just focused on older people. And I think maybe this is something that links injury prevention across the board, actually, is figuring out how we prevent drowning or prevent injuries later in life. And you've done some research in this area, Richard, but it's really that conundrum of more people enjoying themselves later in life, but that enjoyment also exposes them to risk, and risk in aquatic environments is somewhat different to risk in and around the home. But essentially those medical conditions, the impacts of medications are all pretty consistent, whether it's a fall in water or a fall in the home. And I guess injury prevention, at least for water safety, injury prevention involvement, when we think about it, started with child drowning, and perhaps the opportunity to work together also ends with prevention in older people, there's probably more synergies there, an opportunity to work together perhaps there as there was in child drowning prevention going forward.
Thanks, Justin. And I'm glad you brought up the issues. I mean, it's a chronic disease issue as much as anything else. About when we get some achievements that we see coming through, how do we maintain that? You know, we can't stop doing swimming lessons, or as Kate was talking about before, putting the car seats in the car for the young kids. But that's also the same as we see for people eating well or exercising, all those whole range of sort of things. And I think this is a challenge that we can learn from some of the chronic disease space as we kind of look at it and think about how do we bring in that momentum, as Justin was talking about before. Interestingly, everybody's talked about the washing machine. Obviously, people washing their clothes over the weekend, and it's front of mind as we kind of think about it. But it is this kind of, as you say, Kate, this long-term vision, which hopefully, you know, the injury prevention plan starts that. I don't think it's the end of the conversation by any means, but it's very much the start of that kind of conversation as part of it. And I think we've brought up a whole range of issues around sustainability, collaboration, translation, engagement, knowledge transfer, building relationships, the need to focus in on an issue, the need to think about systems and data and communication, think about leadership and education, think about the opportunities that are out there. So I think this has been really neat to kind of start to think about the next steps of the future. And this is not the last webinar that we're going to have around this sort of space. We are going to continue this conversation, hopefully as the plan comes out, and think a little bit more about it. I'm going to hand back to Rachel in a second to bring up some of the Q&A. But Kate, I saw you had wanted to have one last comment.
I did, and it cuts across those issues that do cut across injury, because they also cut across chronic disease, and it's things like alcohol, it's things like socioeconomic disadvantage, it's things like that is associated because of multiple factors, living in rural and remote areas. So there are so many different precursors and risk factors that we can really make sure that we include in our thinking around injury prevention. So we think beyond that, and just taking that example around older people and injury prevention, Justin, we know that if people are engaged and physically active when they're younger, they're less likely to fall later on because they've built up that resilience and resistance. So it really, and it does talk to that long-term planning, is understanding the benefit of what we do now and how that impacts health and safety moving forward. And I think that is one of the critical things that we need to really consider when we're expanding our thinking around injury prevention.
Thanks, Kate. I think a determinants of injury prevention sounds like a great area. It kind of feeds into what Stuart was talking about before around the data and the data needs, and understanding those sort of system things as well. But certainly, we do need to think about the determinants of health. We need to think about the commercial determinants as well that are kind of coming through. We need to think about the environmental determinants, and obviously disasters and things of those spaces are going to impact the work that we do into the future. I think, Rachel, there's some questions around workforce. Have you been picking up on some of this?
Yeah, so a couple of questions have really stemmed around workforce. So the first one, I'm just, I guess, throw it open to any of you, maybe Stuart and Denise to start off with. Lisa's commented that secondments are really common within government, providing that opportunity to learn about different areas within government. And she's asked if what you see as an opportunity, what opportunities you see to enable better collaboration and understanding through secondments between academia and government. She's noted that it's quite common in other countries. Do you have any comments on that?
I think secondments actually can work quite well. It's interesting that MEARC used to do secondments a lot in its early years, but that's tailed off because I guess the demand from the university is to become a lot more academic, given university focus. But I think there's a lot of benefit to be potentially had in secondment. But the parameters around what that needs to achieve through the secondment need to be carefully defined so it's productive, but it certainly helps build the relationships, and we've had a lot of good sort of cross-pollination between organisations through that. I guess the thing that concerns me, and maybe particularly acute in Victoria in the moment, is the public services are in such a a state that knowing how to accommodate those sort of exchanges and to use people appropriately is difficult. One of the things we've been doing instead is what we call our industry graduate program. So we actually have students, graduate students, who spend time working on a theme within one of our organisations, and that actually helps the cross-pollination. So it's not a direct secondment to staff, but it's a conduit through a student project that actually helps the collaboration work. And I think that is actually a really good model, and it's something the government's encouraging generally anyway.
Thanks, Stuart. Denise?
So we've had experience of secondments both ways within my directorate. It doesn't happen that often, and they can be quite difficult to manage because the reality is you're robbing often from very lean teams to begin with. One of the other things that we are open to, and it has certainly happened in other parts of the division that I sit in, is that we're certainly open to researchers that may be conducting research in an area of policy relevance, physically being based within the policy team. So it does mean that there's an opportunity to hear and develop some sort of understanding about the policy makers that would be consuming this research, assuming it continues to have policy relevance. So it's another way of looking at it. So you don't end up with all this industrial relations stuff in terms of people coming in and out of the public sector versus the university sector. The other is, placements within a government agency.
Great, thanks, Denise. We'll move on to our next question from Samantha Menezes, was around workforce development as well. And she's asked, given there's so many disciplines working within injury prevention, is there a need for a national set of, I guess, core competencies for injury prevention practitioners that could inform workforce development across, I guess, the disciplines? We see this within, I guess, health promotion. There's health promotion core competencies, and in with other areas. What are your thoughts on some core competencies for injury prevention? Justin?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I thought I'd weigh into this one. So one of the insights here is sometimes when we talk about this, we focus on the technical skills. So if we facilitated a conversation now to say what are the core injury prevention skills, a lot of people would lean in to talk about very sort of specific technical elements of understanding injury prevention, right? And I actually think going forward, the core skills, so if I was sitting as an individual in the webinar or as an organisation, the things that are going to matter most are actually the interlinkages between the technical skills and technical people, in a sense. I think universities do a perfectly good job of developing specialists and specialist tracks and the like. But actually moving forward, what we need is more and more people who are able to build bridges across the technical specializations. And so the sorts of skills that I would say that were needed to move injury forward rapidly or drowning prevention rapidly are probably beyond the technical specializations, and actually people who can convene, people who can facilitate, people who are able to interpret not just injury prevention science, but are able to go over and look at urban development and decode that particular science and build the bridges between them, right? Or people who are able to really do a deep dive into disaster and figure out whereabouts in that disaster agenda are there opportunities for injury prevention. So if we're talking about workforce skills and workforce development, there's sort of and it's really a picture that's economy-wide, actually. Employers are really valuing those people with agility, people who have really adaptive capacity to identify opportunities and build bridges, that have core communication skills, that are able to listen as much as they talk, which is a reminder that I should shut up very quickly. But from a workforce perspective, I think they're the things that will matter most over the next 5 to 10 years. And so if you're listening, that's the thing you should focus on, as much as the opportunity to deepen your technical specialisation and skills. Those sort of agile skill sets are what organisations need, probably what governments need as well. And that should be part of the injury plan when we get to that point of problem solving a workforce of the future.
And Richard, you've got a question?
So I was just going to add to what Justin was saying. I totally agree with what Justin was talking about around those sets of skills. WHO has just been through the process of reviewing the TEACH VIP, which is the violence and injury prevention, which is a very technical based kind of knowledge around what people should know in each of those spaces. And that is very good for people getting into the field and understanding what's going on. I'd also bring it back to both what the AIPN and the PHAA do around policy development. I think one of the real challenges that we face, one is getting people to obviously get in and help out, but secondly is that real challenge about that I think Stuart was alluding to before about, well, what works? Where do you put your money and where do you actually say, if government's going to do something, where would we like them to do it? And that's not an easy thing to do. And even when you've got lots of research, some of it conflicting, some of it with good evidence, some of it with weak evidence, you've then got to make a decision in a policy-based forum about where you put your money to government around where you think the next investment should be. Not necessarily what government's going to pick up on, but you have to make that real challenge. And I think being able to then chair meetings, being able to communicate with people, being able to negotiate some of those sorts of things is really important in that policy aspect, which are skills that you can then take elsewhere if you're wanting kind of a venue to start to learn some of those sorts of skills and work on them. So again, a big plug for the policy work that both the groups do and work on, because I think it's a really challenging space to both work in and come up with good advice.
Thanks, Richard. And Kate, would you like to have closing comments?
I don't know if it'll be closing, other than to say I absolutely echo what you were saying there, Richard, and as well, Justin, that we need the bridge. We absolutely need the bridge, but we need the foundations for the bridge as well. So we need to know what is that information that's needed, how good is that information, what is it grounded on? So having that community of practice that we've spoken about as well, where there's the opportunity to distill and understand data and share it appropriately and in a timely way, to distill the evidence that's available and the effectiveness of interventions, understand the pragmatic nature and translation and the scalability of programs as well. So that community of practice can help provide that, so that the bridge can then be made to ensure that that information gets to where it needs to go and is realised. So I totally agree with that need for that the bridge, but it needs to be balanced.
Thanks so much, Kate. On that note, I guess there's a chance here. We've talked a lot about the importance of collaboration and relationship building. There is no better place to do that than by joining the AIPN, and if you're interested, joining the Public Health Association Injury Prevention Special Interest Groups. PHA and AIPN are two groups that have that same vision for injury prevention, and we're working together. And there is that opportunity, if you're interested to get involved, come along for the ride, I guess, get involved in policy development and activities. With that also, I guess, a couple of activities or events that are coming up across AIPN, PHA, Injury Matters and other groups throughout Australia. In particular, there's some lovely conferences happening at the later in the year in Perth. We've got the Falls Prevention Conference and the World Drowning Prevention Conference in Perth. But I also wanted to recap what Kate had said. Early next year, we have the Australasian Injury Prevention and Safety Promotion Conference that's going to be hosted in beautiful Rotorua, New Zealand. This event will be a thought-provoking event that's going to bring together experts from across Australasia. So we really hope to see everyone there. I will just take a moment to say thank you to the panel again for your time. We really appreciate what you have shared. It's really been, I think, a really great conversation. And as Richard said, this is just a starting point. We hope to be able to bring more of these webinars to you in the future. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my colleague Apu at Injury Matters, who's made everything happen behind the scenes. And if you have a moment, can you please at the end of the session, provide your feedback on today's webinar, because that will help inform future events for Injury Matters, AIPN and PHAA. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, panel members. Thank you, audience. That's it for this webinar. Look forward to catching up with you in a future one. And it was a really great discussion, and hopefully the next steps are closer than we think. Bye.
Indeed. Thank you.